The cell smelled like copper and old electricity. That was the first thing Dax Mercer noticed when he regained consciousness. Not the restraints, binding his wrists to the wall mount. Not the dried blood sealing his left eye half shut. Not even the low, subsonic hum that vibrated up through the floor and into his molars like a dentist drill made of sound. It was the smell. Copper and old electricity, the particular combination his brain had cataloged years ago as the smell of places where bad things happened, methodically by design, with paperwork. He'd been in enough of those places to know. He rolled his shoulders carefully, testing the restraints. High-tensile polymer, probably rated to something like 800 kilograms of pull force. His wrists weren't going anywhere. His ankles were similarly secured, the chain between them long enough to let him stand, but not long enough for a running stride. Someone had thought this through. He thought about that while he waited for his eye to stop throbbing. 3 days. That was how long it had been. Since the hegemony boarding party had cut through the hull of the Yusuf destroyer. Carthage, with the particular efficiency of a people who had been breaching human warships for 11 years and had gotten very good at it. 3 days since Dax had been alive and in command of Recon Team 7. As of the moment the hegemony soldiers came through the emergency bulkhead with their sonic suppression nets, he had been alive and in captivity, which was a different thing, but still technically in the column marked living. He was counting that as a win for now. The hum in the floor changed pitch slightly. Dax lifted his head. The cell door was a single slab of some dark metal alloy he didn't recognize. Heavier than titanium by the way it moved, smoother, the hinges concealed inside the frame. So there was nothing to attack and nothing to grip. It swung open without a sound, and 2 hegemony guards stepped inside. They were Vethara. He'd learned to tell the subspecies apart over 4 years of field deployments. The Vethara were the hegemony's ground enforcement caste. Bipedal but wrong in the proportions, their torsos too long, and their legs operating on a reverse joint configuration that made them fast in short bursts, but oddly graceful at rest. Their skin was a deep iridescent gray, almost blue in certain lights. Their eyes were compound, 12 faceted lenses arranged in a shallow arc across their brow ridges, and they tracked motion extraordinarily well. Their hearing was poor by human standards. Dax had used that. He let himself hang limp in the restraints as they released the wall mounts, keeping his weight passive, his breathing slow. One of them gripped his arm. The other flanked him. They were careful, not because they thought he was dangerous, he suspected, but because their protocols said to be. The hegemony ran on protocols. That was the thing about them that Dax had spent 4 years trying to explain to people who'd never met one. The hegemony wasn't cruel, exactly. They weren't sadistic. They simply processed humanity as a resource problem. And they were solving it the way an engineer solved a problem. Efficiently, systematically, without turcular malice or particular mercy. You weren't a person to them. You were a variable in an equation they'd already mostly solved. 11 years of war. 147 human colony worlds gone. Earth's outer defense ring shattered. The Galactic Council, that great deliberative body of 43 recognized sapient species, watching from the sidelines, technically neutral, practically terrified of the hegemony's fleet tonnage and the long reach of their political influence. The corridor outside the cell was white and very bright. Dax blinked against it, committing details to memory without appearing to look. Camera nodes, every 60 meters, positioned to cover each other's blind spots. Floor material was a composite that gave slightly underweight. Good acoustic insulation. The guard's footfalls were near silent. His own boots, still on his feet, made a faint squeak on the 4th step. He counted steps. 94 steps from his cell to the first intersection. Left turn. 61 steps to what appeared to be a lift bay. Three platforms occupied with cargo frames, one open. They put him on the open platform. It ascended, not descended, which meant he was underground and currently moving toward the surface, which meant this was a surface facility, not a subterranean prison complex. The hegemony preferred subterranean for their long-term holding operations, which meant this wasn't long-term. He had that in the part of his mind labeled, "Things that should concern me," and kept his expression blank. The lift opened onto a wide, high-ceilinged chamber that smelled of disinfectant, and something underneath it, something organic, something like a wound that had been cleaned repeatedly but couldn't quite close. Medical. Or something adjacent to medical. The floor here was spotless white composite, and the lighting was colder, bluer, the kind of light that was designed for precision work rather than comfort. Around the edges of the chamber, workstations, and at the workstations, Vithara in lab configurations rather than combat ones. No weapons, different garment markings, four-fingered hands working at instruments with the focused illness of people who found their work genuinely interesting. In the center of the chamber, a single observation platform. On the platform, a human. Dax stopped walking. One of his guards made a sound, not quite language, more a directional click, and shoved him forward. He moved, but he kept his eyes on the figure on the platform. The man was standing. That was the first thing. Standing straight, no restraints, feet planted at shoulder width, arms loose at his sides. He was tall, broad through the chest, with the kind of muscle that came from actual use rather than any augmentation program Dax recognized. His hair had been cut short recently. His jaw was set. His eyes were open, and they were tracking the room with a slow, methodical sweep that Dax recognized with a cold, quiet shock. Tactical assessment. The man was doing a tactical assessment. He wasn't a prisoner, not in the conventional sense. He was a demonstration, the hegemony researcher at the primary workstation. Tall even for a Vithara, which made her very tall, with lab markings in deep ochre along her collar that indicated senior designation, turned to address Dax directly in the hegemony's second contact language. Not native Vithara, but the engineered pidgin they'd developed specifically for communicating with the species they processed. You were designated Dax Mercer. Human. Rank Captain. Recon Specialization, 11 years active service. Pause. You will observe. I'll do whatever I like, Dax said. The researcher tilted her head at an angle that conveyed something between amusement and the acknowledgement that the statement was factually incorrect. You will observe, she said again, without particular emphasis, and turned back to her workstation. The man on the platform, Dax still didn't know his name, turned his head fractionally toward Dax. Their eyes met for exactly the duration of a blink. And in that blink, Dax read something that he would spend a long time afterward thinking about. It wasn't fear. It wasn't resignation. It wasn't the hollow, evacuated look that combat veterans sometimes got after long captivity. It was the look of a man who was paying attention and waiting for a specific thing. Dax made himself relax his jaw. He breathed through his nose and he watched. The researcher spoke a short, clipped sequence into her workstation. 3 of the other lab personnel moved to secondary stations. Something in the floor of the platform began to glow. A warm amber ring, non-threatening, almost decorative. The man on the platform looked at it, looked away. The researcher spoke again. This time the platform ring went dark, and instead the man's left hand lit up. Not lit up. That was the wrong framing. Dax corrected himself immediately. The way his field training had taught him to correct first impressions. Because first impressions were the most dangerous kind. The man's hand hadn't lit up. It had become partially translucent, the skin fading to something like smoked glass. And underneath it, running along the metacarpals and up into the wrist, was a lattice of dark material that was embedded in the tissue, rather than on top of it. The researcher said something to her staff, that Dax's pidgin wasn't good enough to follow. One of them responded. The researcher nodded, a human gesture, he noticed, which meant she'd spent significant time in human contact contexts. The man on the platform flexed his hand. The lattice pulsed once with a faint light. His expression didn't change. Dax understood then, with a calm that surprised him, exactly what he was looking at. He'd read the intelligence reports. He'd read them 3 times, actually, because the first 2 times he'd been certain he'd misunderstood something. The Hegemony's Xenobiological Research Division had been, for some time, investigating the structural properties of Earth-native organisms as templates for military augmentation, not because Earth's life forms were impressive by galactic standards. The Hegemony's own biosphere was vastly more diverse, but because something in the specific evolutionary pressures of Earth kept producing organisms with a particular property. Resilience. Earth was, by galactic consensus, a statistical anomaly. Most life-bearing worlds settled into rough equilibria. Species adapted to their niches. Extinction events were catastrophic and lasting. Evolution moved at the pace of deep time. Earth's evolutionary record, by contrast, read like a system that had been set on fire repeatedly and kept regrowing. 5 mass extinctions, each one followed by explosive radiation of new forms. An oxygen content and atmospheric pressure that would be lethal to most known sapients. Temperature swings that would sterilize average continental ecosystems. And yet, life, stubbornly, furiously, inventively alive, the intelligence reports had suggested. And Dax had thought this was the part he was misreading, that the Hegemony had identified a specific genetic mechanism common to a broad spectrum of Earth's insectoid organisms, concentrated most intensely in the order Blatodea. Cockroaches. Of all the things to find remarkable about humanity's homeworld, the Hegemony's finest xenobiologist had landed on the cockroach. The mechanism had something to do with radiation tolerance, the specific biochemical pathway that allowed certain Earth insects to survive ionizing radiation levels that would kill most other known life. And the Hegemony's theory, tested now, apparently, in practice on the man standing on the platform, was that this mechanism could be integrated into human biology to produce soldiers with dramatically enhanced endurance under combat conditions that involved radiation, vacuum exposure, and the particular energetic weapons the Hegemony used in fleet engagement where local shielding was compromised. The theory, as Dax understood it, was that you could make a better human soldier by making a human slightly less human. He watched the man flex his hand again, watched the lattice pulse, watched the man's face, which remained entirely controlled, but was doing something interesting around the eyes. Not pain, exactly. Something more like the expression of a person tolerating something. Dax had worn that expression himself. The tolerating kind. The I am still here kind. How many, he said. Directed at the researcher, but not really. She understood the question. The program processes 42 subjects per cycle, she said. You are observing the 7th successful integration. The previous 6 are operational. Operational where? They are currently serving in forward interdiction roles in Sector 9. A pause. The precise pause of someone deciding whether additional information served their purpose. They are performing adequately. Dax looked at the man on the platform. The man's eyes came back to his for another blink-length moment, and this time, Dax thought he caught something underneath the control. Something that wasn't quite a message because there was no content to it. Just a flicker of aliveness, of the peculiar human refusal to vacate a situation even when leaving would be easier. Why are you showing me this? Dax asked. You will be integrated into the program, the researcher said. We find that subjects who observe the process before undergoing it cooperate more consistently. The resulting integration is cleaner. And if I don't cooperate? The researcher's 12-lens eyes tracked to him with the mild, unhurried attention of someone who had been asked this question before and found it uninteresting. The integration proceeds regardless, she said. Cooperation affects the quality of the outcome, not its occurrence. Dax nodded once. He looked at the man on the platform again. He thought about the reports, about the specific language they'd used. Integration. Augmentation. Processing. The clean technical vocabulary of people who had decided that thing being altered wasn't really a person, so there was no need to account for what it wanted. He thought about 11 years of war and 147 colony worlds. He thought about a word his grandmother had used, a woman who'd lived through a different kind of systematic processing, a woman who'd had a particular way of looking at problems that other people had called stubbornness, and that she had called something else. Patience, she'd said. Not giving up, not the same thing. Patience is giving up on the timeline without giving up on the outcome. Dax said, "All right." The researcher turned back to her workstation. One of the guards released the restraint on Dax's right wrist. He used the free hand to rub circulation back into it, slowly, making no sudden moves. He watched the chamber. He cataloged every exit. He memorized the spacing of the workstations, the positions of personnel, the one door on the far wall that was a different material from the others. Lighter, less reinforced, probably a supply access rather than a security exit. He found the security camera coverage gaps. He found the one guard who stood at the edge of her patrol pattern and shifted her weight when she'd been standing too long, the particular shift of someone whose left knee gave her trouble. He waited. The man on the platform, Dax still didn't know his name, caught his eye one more time as the guards moved Dax toward the secondary holding area on the chamber's west wall. This time the man's expression did something small and unmistakable. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, more the ghost of one. The acknowledgement that someone was in the room who was paying the same kind of attention he was. Dax kept his own face blank, but in the privacy of his chest, something very old and very stubborn shifted from the column marked "Surviving" to the column marked "Planning." It was, he decided, a meaningful distinction. Sergeant Yale Oren had been captured 6 weeks before Dax Mercer, which meant she had 6 additional weeks of intelligence, and 6 additional weeks of reasons to want out of this particular facility. She was also, by her own assessment and several independent expert opinions, better at staying alive in bad places than almost anyone the USEF had produced in a This was not arrogance. It was the kind of operational self-knowledge that kept people breathing in situations self-deception got you killed. She knew what she was good at. She knew what she wasn't good at. She had structured her survival strategy around the former, what she was good at: patience, observation, spatial memory, the kind of physical strength that didn't advertise itself, and a particular capacity for remaining very still for very long periods of time while her brain processed information at high speed. What she wasn't good at: accepting that a situation was unwinnable. She had a genuine cognitive limitation around this, which her psyche valves had flagged twice, and which she had consistently dismissed as a misclassification of persistence as pathology. She'd been in the secondary holding block for 6 weeks. In that time, she'd learned the patrol schedules, the shift rotations, the acoustic properties of the corridor outside her cell, the specific timing lag between the checkpoint signal, and the lock mechanism on her cell door, and the full structural layout of what she estimated to be the facility's eastern wing, based entirely on sound, and the behavior of air currents through the ventilation grid. She'd also learned that there were 31 other humans in the holding block. She hadn't met any of them, but she'd heard them. Not voices. The cells were too well insulated for that. But human movement has a rhythm that is distinct from Vithara movement, the specific weight distribution, the frequency of position shifts, the way humans tend to tap or scratch or hum when they're in confined spaces for a long time. Small sounds, mammalian sounds. 31 distinct patterns in 31 adjacent cells, and she had mapped them all and given them private designators based on their behavioral signatures. Cell 12 tapped Morse code sometimes, though not coherently, possibly without knowing it, possibly just the compulsive repetition of a remembered pattern. Cell 7 paced, exactly, 11 steps, turn, 11 steps, turn, for hours at a stretch. Military background, almost certainly. The count was too precise to be anything else. Cell 19 sang, very quietly, just under the threshold of the ventilation acoustics, songs in a language Yale couldn't identify. She'd found herself looking forward to it. Cell 22 had gone silent in week 4 and hadn't made a sound since. Yale had allocated a specific portion of her daily mental resources to not thinking about what that meant. Then, at the start of week 6, a new pattern entered the block. Cell 3, which had been empty for 5 days. The new occupant arrived without the stumbling disorientation of someone fresh from processing. No off-balance gait, no extended period of sitting. They walked to the wall. They stood. Then they did a slow, deliberate circuit of the cell, pausing at specific intervals. Assessing. Yale sat up straighter on her cot. She listened. The new occupant in Cell 3 completed their circuit. Then they sat. Then, after approximately 30 seconds, they did something that made Yale's breath catch. They tapped, once, on the wall shared between Cell 3 and Cell 2. Not Morse, not random. A specific interval pattern. Short, long, short, that Yale recognized from the Yusef's field communication protocols as the standard 3-field grid distress signal used for covert contact when electronic communication was unavailable. Field protocol. This person was trained in Yusef field protocol. They were identifying themselves. Yale moved to the wall between her cell and the one adjacent, which shared a wall with Cell 3 through 2 intermediate cells. The signal wouldn't carry that far through standard composite construction, but she knew something about this facility's construction that the hegemony probably didn't realize she knew. The ventilation grid ran horizontally through the block at a height of roughly 2 meters, with distribution channels branching to each cell from a shared trunk line. Sound traveled the trunk line with remarkable fidelity. She'd been using it for 6 weeks to track her 31 neighbors. She stood on her cot, put her mouth close to the ventilation grate, and tapped the grid 3 times with her knuckle. Short, long, short. Half of the first signal back, confirming the return. A 30-second pause. Then, from somewhere along the ventilation chain, a voice, pitched low enough to be almost below speech. "You hear me?" She heard him. She breathed. Another pause. "How long?" 6 weeks. "You?" "New. Just came from the main processing floor." A silence. She counted her heartbeats in it. "There's a program." "I know about the program," she said. "I've seen 3 transports leave. They came back with..." She stopped, restarted. "They came back different. 7 integrated so far. They're adding to the cycle." "How many per cycle?" 42. She absorbed that. "The integrated ones, are they conscious?" A longer silence. "The one I saw was," he said. He was paying attention. "That's worse," she said. "Yeah." She pressed her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling of her cell, the same ceiling she'd been looking at for 6 weeks. The ambient hum of the facility moved through the composite like a living thing, the particular frequency of hegemony power systems, something in the 47 hertz range that she'd learned to sort to the back of her awareness. "There's an exit," she said. "Supply access, eastern wall of the main processing chamber. I've mapped the approach from this block. 12 cells between us. I can get us synchronized if you can get a door open. What's your contingency if the timing slips?" "I don't have one," she said. "I have precision instead." Another pause. This one felt different from the others. She had the strong sense that the person on the other end of the ventilation channel was smiling. "I'm Mercer," he said. "Dax Mercer. Captain. Orin. Yale, Sergeant." How many others can you bring, she thought, of her 31 neighbors. Cell 12 with the tapped Morse. Cell 7 with the precise 11-step pace. Cell 19 with the quiet songs in the unidentified language. Cell 22 silent. "Enough," she said. There was a man named Cairo in Cell 7. She learned this 2 days later, when the ventilation network had been repurposed into what y'all privately thought of as the most improbable communications infrastructure in this sector of the galaxy. Not names. She was careful about that. There were protocols about names in captivity. Names could be extracted, but identifiers, capabilities, states of physical readiness. Cell 7 had a mechanical engineering background and had spent 3 days working on the timing mechanism of his door lock with a sliver of composite he'd broken from his cot frame. He was close. Cell 12 had a med-spec background and 2 stress fractures in her right hand that she'd set herself, using the wall as a brace, which Yale assessed as both impressive and practically useful. Cell 19, his name was Thomas, and he didn't give his last name, and she didn't ask, was former deep space navigation, which meant his spatial orientation and timing were exceptional, and he could calculate trajectories in his head that most people needed instruments. For Cell 22 was alive, quiet but alive. The silence had been deliberate, she learned, a conservation strategy, pulling down to the minimum metabolic and cognitive expenditure required to preserve function. When he came back up, when the ventilation brought her his voice, for the first time it was entirely steady. His name was Lev, former for fleet combat, infantry cross-trained. He was the largest man she'd never met. There were 26 others between those 5 and the far end of the block, and she couldn't reach them all through the ventilation trunk without risking the signal being picked up, but she built a relay through the ones she could. And the relay carried planning while appearing to anything that might be monitoring, like the random acoustic noise of people in confinement making small human sounds. 11 days after Dax Mercer arrived in Cell 3, she was ready. She lay on to cot the night before and went through it one final time. The hegemony's patrol rotation had a 17-second gap at the Cell 3 to Cell 9 corridor junction between the withdrawal of the 02 sweep and the arrival of the 0277s. 17 seconds was enough. Cell 7 had the lock mechanism cracked. She had provided timing instructions to every cell in the relay. Cell 12 was the medical contingency. Thomas from Cell 19 had the route mapped to the ventilation's main trunk, which ran to the eastern wall of the processing chamber, which had the supply access door. The only variable she hadn't fully solved was what came after the door. She didn't know what was beyond the eastern wall. She had acoustic data suggesting it was a loading area of some kind, wide space, low-frequency ambient, the particular echo of large machinery at rest. She had inference suggesting there would be transport vehicles of some kind, because the facility needed to move its outputs. She did not have certainty. She lay with that uncertainty for a long time, in the dark, listening to the hum of the facility. She thought about Cell 22, about the silence that had lasted 17 days before Lev's voice came back up, through the ventilation, steady and calm, ready. About what it had cost to go somewhere that quiet inside yourself, and then choose to come back. She thought about the man on the platform in Dax's account. The 7th successful integration. The one who'd looked at Dax with that small, not quite a smile. She'd asked Dax about him twice now, pressing for details she wasn't sure why she needed. His description was precise and consistent. Early 30s, broad build, the integrated lattice in his left hand, eyes that were still tactical, still present, still paying a specific kind of attention. She thought about what the hegemony's researcher had said. The integration proceeds regardless. Cooperation affects the quality of the outcome, not its occurrence. She thought about what it meant that the 7th integration was still paying attention. It meant something was still there, under whatever they'd done, whatever they'd added, whatever they'd taken away, whatever technical process had embedded that lattice into the tissue of his hand. Something in him was still running its own assessment, still mapping exits, still waiting for a specific thing. You couldn't plan for him. He was outside her relay, on the processing floor, or deployed, or somewhere in the facility she had no map for. But she found herself factoring him in anyway, leaving a margin in her planning. The way you left a margin, when you knew there was a variable you couldn't account for, but that you had some evidence wasn't working against you. In the dark, with the hum of the facility moving through the composite walls, Yale Oren made peace with the uncertainty and went to sleep. At 02 she was already awake. The gap was 16 seconds, not 17. She'd been miscounting by 1 in the far corridor sweep. She knew this in the first 2 seconds of execution, when the sweep team turned at the junction point a beat earlier than she'd predicted. She'd built the margin into the relay. They moved. The cord was white and very bright, same as Dax had described, from the processing chamber. She'd never been in it before. Her previous transport to and from the holding block had been done unconscious, the standard arrival procedure. And there was a brief, disorienting moment where her 6 weeks of acoustic and inference mapping met the reality of physical space and didn't quite align. The corridor was longer than she'd calculated. The lighting was positioned differently. She ran the recalibration in 3 steps and kept moving. Behind her, Dax, Cell 7, whose name turned out to be Cairo Amara, and who was shorter than she'd pictured. Thomas, from Cell 19, Lev from Cell 22, who was as large as she'd imagined, and who moved with the particular quietness of very large people who'd learned to be precise. Cell 12, whose name was Rosario, and who was cradling her right hand against her chest, but keeping pace, and 14 others from the relay network, whom she knew by behavioral signature only, and was meeting for the first time in motion. 20 people, 20 humans, moving through a hegemony facility toward an exit that might not go anywhere useful, in a sector of space that was 11 years, deep in a war they'd been losing. She didn't think about that. She thought about the next junction, and the timing, and where Dax was relative to her left shoulder, which was where she'd placed him, and where she needed him. Kiro went to work on the eastern wall access panel with the same sliver of composite he'd used on his cell door, his hands moving fast, and without hesitation, the particular confidence of someone who'd been solving this exact category of problem for 11 days in his head, and was now just executing the solution. 40 seconds. She'd given him 40 seconds. He got it in 31. The door swung open on darkness and the smell of machine oil, and something else. Ozone, the residue of energy systems at rest, confirming the loading area. Yale went through first, her eyes adjusted. There were vehicles, 4 transport haulers in a line against the far wall, broad-bodied, designed for moving large cargo frames. Beyond them, a bay door to the exterior. Current status, sealed, but the manual override panel was visible from where she stood. There were also 3 hegemony loading personnel, all non-combat, all with the particular stillness of people who had not expected this, and were in the process of deciding what to do about it. Dax was through the door 2 seconds and behind her. Left, she said very quietly. He was already going left. What followed took approximately 90 seconds and involved no weapons. She logged this detail afterward because she'd thought it would require weapons, and it hadn't. And the reason it hadn't was interesting. The 3 loading personnel froze. Not from cowardice, she didn't read it as cowardice. From something more like an information processing failure. They had protocols for many situations. They did not have a protocol for 20 humans. Emerging from a sealed holding area in the middle of a night. Cycle with the particular organized momentum of people who'd had 11 days to think about exactly this. The hegemony ran on protocols. When there wasn't one, there was a lag. She used the lag. Caro had the bay door open in the time it took the first loading personnel to move toward the alarm relay. Lev, very calmly and with no apparent hurry, placed himself between the alarm relay and the loading personnel who was moving toward it. He didn't touch her. He just occupied the space with his full physical presence, the specific weight and dimension of a very large man who had decided he was standing there, and the Vethra loading specialist stopped and stared at him with all 12 facets of her compound eyes and did not push through. Yale had not planned for Lev to do that. She filed it under human variables that pay off. They went through the bay door into the cold night air of whatever world the hegemony had built this facility on. She didn't know its name. It had a gravity that was slightly higher than Earth standard. She could feel it in her knees, and a sky that was dark purple-black, the atmospheric scatter of a primary star that was redder and cooler than Sol. There were no moons she could see, or the moons were below the horizon, and the only light came from the facility's exterior panels and the distant, very distant, ambient glow of what might be a settlement on the horizon. 21 humans stood in the open air of an alien world and looked up. Dax came to stand beside her. She was aware of him without looking. the particular quality of his stillness, which was different from her stillness in a way she found difficult to articulate. She was still in the way of a system at rest. He was still in the way of a system that had decided resting was the current best option. "There's a communications array on the roof," he said. "East side. I saw it on the approach when they brought me in. Can you reach it? With Cairo's help in about 12 minutes. What do you plan to broadcast?" A pause. The particular pause of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time and was now choosing how to say it. "Everything," he said. The Galactic Council's standing monitoring infrastructure was, by the consensus of every intelligence service that had attempted to map it, both extraordinarily comprehensive and extraordinarily easy to access by anyone who understood its architecture. The Council didn't hide its signals protocols. They were a diplomatic body. Their entire function was communication. Their monitoring array covered the volume of the known arm with a resolution sufficient to detect a standard power transmission from any fixed surface installation in their catalog territory. This facility was in catalog territory. The hegemony had, of course, legal access to the Council's territory as a recognized member species. The war with humanity was, in the Council's official designation, a regional resource conflict between a recognized member species and a non-member aspirant civilization, which was their way of saying they had declined to rule on it either way, and were hoping it would resolve before they had to. What the Council's charter did not permit, under any legal framework any of the 43 member species had ratified, was non-consensual biological modification of any sapient organism for military purposes. This was Article 17 of the Concordance of Personhood, enacted 400 years ago after a war that the Council's founding members had decided they never wanted to see repeated. Dax Mercer knew about Article 17 because he'd spent 11 years watching the hegemony do things that seemed to him like they should be violations of it, and every time he'd asked the legal question, someone had explained to him the specific technical distinctions the hegemony used to argue that their activities fell outside the article's scope. Those arguments were about to become significantly harder to make. The communications array was military band, hegemony manufacture, designed for encrypted transmission to their fleet command. Cairo could not break the encryption. What he could do, and this was the thing Dax had realized while standing in the processing chamber watching a man he didn't know flex a hand that had something embedded in the tissue of it, was route around it. The array's power plant was accessible from the maintenance access on its base. The maintenance access accepted a standard diagnostic override command, which Cairo had in his head because Cairo had spent 3 years as a field systems engineer before his infantry cross-training. And he had the particular gift of retaining technical information at a molecular level. The diagnostic override disabled the encryption module. An unencrypted military band transmission at full power from a surface installation in catalog territory would be picked up by the Council's monitoring infrastructure. Within 43 seconds of broadcast initiation, the Council's emergency protocols required a response acknowledgement within 90 seconds of detection. What Dax Mercer's broadcast on that unencrypted band in the Council's second contact language for 11 minutes and 27 seconds before the facility's alarm systems found them was a precise, detailed, technical account of the program he'd observed in the processing chamber. The integration protocol, the subject profile, the scale 42 per cycle, 7 completed, operational in Sector 9, the hegemony researcher's designation, the specific nature of the biological modification, and its intended military application. He also broadcast the coordinates of the facility, and then, at the end, he said something that he had not planned to say, and which surprised him when he heard himself saying it. He said, the 7th integration was still paying attention. Whatever you do to a human being, whatever you add or subtract, something in us stays aware, stays present, stays planning. I don't know if you consider that remarkable. I think you should. We're asking the Council to consider it too. He stopped the broadcast when the alarm reached them. They ran. There is a specific quality to the chaos that follows a successful escape from a hegemony facility that Yale would later describe in the official after-action report that nobody expected her to survive long enough to write as instructive. The hegemony's response was fast and well executed by any objective standard. The facility's alert sequence triggered an immediate perimeter lockdown, drone deployment, and rapid response team mobilization that were exactly as fast and as coordinated as their protocols specified. Their protocols, however, were written for a threat that was trying to run. 20 humans weren't running. Not exactly. Running was for people who had somewhere to go. They had a horizon with a possible settlement on it, and 12 minutes of head start, and the knowledge that the Galactic Council's monitoring infrastructure had received 11 minutes and 27 seconds of unencrypted testimony. What they were doing was something more like existing, very deliberately and very stubbornly, in the space between the facility and its protocols. Lev led the rear. He was not fast, but he was large, and he was effective in a way that had something to do with the specific use of terrain that infantry cross-training produced and that Yale recognized as something her own training had given her. The capacity to see a piece of ground as a problem with solutions, rather than a surface to move across. He made choices about where to be that consistently meant the rapid response teams spent time dealing with him rather than the people ahead of him. He did this for 45 minutes, which was longer than she'd thought he'd be able to sustain it, and she found herself periodically counting to confirm he was still making noise behind her. He always was. Thomas from Cell 19 navigated. His spatial mapping was exactly as precise as she'd predicted from 6 weeks of behavioral signature analysis. He made one error in 45 minutes, immediately recognized it, corrected in 3 seconds. She trusted him the way she trusted her own instruments, and was aware that this was a significant form of trust to extend to someone whose last name she didn't know. Rosario, with the stress fractures in her right hand, ran the full distance. She didn't complain. She ran with her hand tucked against her chest, and she kept pace. And when she looked at Yale, it was with a particular kind of focus that Yale knew from looking in mirrors. The look of someone who has narrowed the entire universe to the immediate task and is not permitting anything outside that perimeter. Human biology, the galactic science community had noted in numerous peer-reviewed publications, was unremarkably average by most metrics. Human sensory range was limited. Human physical strength was in the lower quartiles for sapient species of comparable size. Human lifespan was middling. Human cognitive processing speed, measured in standard neural computation equivalents, was not exceptional. What the peer-reviewed literature had never quite found a metric for was the specific capacity Yale was watching in action as 20 people who had been in isolated captivity ran through an alien night without knowing where they were going, coordinating with each other with minimal communication, adapting to terrain they'd never seen, making decisions under time pressure with incomplete information and calibrated fear. Not panicked, not frozen, but properly afraid in a way that was sharpening everything rather than dulling it. She thought about this as she ran. She thought about it in the same background processing thread she used for breathing and footfall and threat assessment. She thought the hegemony had been trying to understand what made humans useful as soldiers. They'd looked at the biology, the genetics, the specific cellular mechanisms that let cockroaches walk away from radiation that killed more complex organisms. They'd been trying to find the mechanism. They'd been looking at the wrong level. The mechanism wasn't in the cells. It wasn't in the DNA. It was in something considerably harder to embed in a lattice. The settlement was 4 kilometers out, and was, as Thomas had calculated, accessible before the drone perimeter reached full extent. It was not a human settlement. It was a Vethara civilian habitation. Low-profile structures, the characteristic deep blue lighting of Vethara residential architecture, early morning quiet. They went through the outer edge of it like water around obstacles, deliberate and careful, leaving nothing disturbed. On the eastern edge of the settlement, there was a landing pad. On the landing pad, there were 2 vessels. One hegemony military courier, locked and alarmed, and one civilian cargo runner of a make Yale didn't recognize. Kiro looked at the cargo runner for approximately 4 seconds. "Can you fly it?" Dax asked. "It's a Threnek 7 hull configuration," Kiro said. "I flew a 6 once. Controls should be analogous." A pause. Probably, Dax repeated. 60% confidence. "Good enough," Yale said. "Go." He went. The Council monitoring station in Sector 7, orbital platform designation CMO-447, received the transmission from the surface installation at the timestamp that would later become part of the official record of what the Council's historiography division eventually designated as the Phelps Incident. After the lead researcher, though Yale always thought they should named it after the man on the platform who'd already been awake when it mattered. The duty officer that shift was a Quillari, one of the Council's founding species, long-lived, procedurally meticulous, with a reputation for taking the concordance of personhood more seriously than some of her colleagues. Her name was not recordable in human phonology, but in the official documentation she appeared as Station Officer V9. She reviewed the transmission in full before initiating her response protocol. This was not procedurally required. The protocol required only that she confirm reception and forward to the relevant committee. She reviewed it in full anyway. Then she reviewed it again. Then she filed the emergency escalation to the full council that bypassed the relevant committee entirely, which was technically in violation of procedure, but was within her discretionary authority under Clause 44 of the station operating mandate, which she had read more carefully than her supervisors had likely anticipated. Clause 44 stated that a station officer could escalate directly to full council review when, in the officer's judgment, the subject matter had immediate implications for the interpretation of Article 17 that could not be adequately addressed through standard committee processing timelines. Station Officer V9 decided that 42 per cycle constituted immediate implications. The Council's emergency session was convened 19 hours later. It was the fastest emergency convening in the Council's recorded history, which stretched back approximately 400 years, which is either a testament to the urgency of the situation or to the fact that 400 years of diplomatic protocol had left the Council somewhat more capable of moving fast when it wanted to than its public reputation suggested. The hegemony's designated speaker to the Council, a political appointee of the senior caste, a figure who was exceptionally skilled at the specific kind of argument that made violation appear to be compliance and processing appear to be something else, had prepared a response. The response drew on the 6 specific technical distinctions the hegemony had developed over 11 years for situations exactly like this. It was a good response. It was, by the standards of Council diplomacy, very nearly airtight. The Council reviewed the response. Then the Council asked to speak with the 7th integration. His name was Oren Vasek. She learned this later. He'd been a structural engineer on a colony world before his capture, a fact that seemed irrelevant until you understood that structural engineers were, fundamentally, people who spent their careers solving for conditions where things were trying to fall down and who developed a specific professional reflex around finding the one point of leverage that held everything else up. The Council's request to speak with him was, itself, a form of leverage. The hegemony could not refuse it without implying that he was unable to speak for himself, which would require explaining why he was unable to speak for himself, which would require admitting things about the program that the speaker's carefully prepared response had been designed to obscure. They gave him access to a Council communications terminal. He used it for exactly 7 minutes. He did not perform distress. He did not perform anger. He sat at the terminal with the particular stillness that Dax had described. The system at rest stillness, the stillness of a man who had been waiting for a specific thing, and he answered every question the council asked him with precise, specific, technical accuracy. He described the physical sensation of the integration process. He described what he had retained and what had changed. He described the 6 others, their states, their behaviors, what remained of their volition, and what had been affected. He described the man who'd stood in the doorway of the processing chamber on the first day, 11 days before he knew Dax Mercer's name, and how he'd known from the quality of the attention that the man was already planning. He said, "I want to go home," not as an appeal for sympathy, as a statement of fact, as the most precise possible description of the ongoing state of his biology, his psychology, his identity, and his will, all of which remained under everything, oriented toward that. The council voted. The legal proceedings lasted 16 months. Yael spent most of them in temporary quarters on Council Station Meridian, which was not as comfortable as the name implied, and which was populated. In the section the Yusuf diplomatic team had been assigned, with approximately 60 human military and civilian personnel, who were there to provide testimony, documentation, and whatever context the council required. 60 humans in a section of a council station that had been built for Vethara occupancy, which meant the ceilings were too high and the furniture was scaled wrong, and the food preparation systems had been adapted by someone who had read about human dietary requirements, but had not quite grasped the concept of flavor. They adapted. They always adapted. Cell 7, Cairo, turned out to have strong opinions about food and spent 3 weeks reverse engineering the preparation system into something tolerable. Thomas from Cell 19 turned out to speak 3 non-human languages that the council's diplomatic staff hadn't expected, which created a personnel situation that the Yusuf diplomatic lead found frustrating and that the council's translation division found very useful. Rosario, with stress-fractured hand now, properly treated by council medical staff and healing with what the attending physician described as unnecessary rapidity, organized the 60 humans into a functional social unit with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done exactly this in worse circumstances and considered it baseline competency. Lev did not say much, but he was present, and people found the presence useful in a way that was difficult to articulate. They watched the proceedings from the observer gallery when they were permitted. The council chamber was enormous, tiered, circular, with the lighting and acoustic design of a place built for the specific purpose of serious deliberation by species that took their architecture seriously. 43 species, 43 delegations, 43 sets of sensory apparatus processing the same information and arriving at, it turned out, conclusions that varied less than Yale had expected. The hegemony speaker was skilled. She had to acknowledge that. These were technically sophisticated. The distinctions precisely drawn, the alternative framings of Article 17's scope, genuinely challenging to counter on purely legal grounds. There were 2 members of the council's legal committee who found the hegemony's position more defensible than she'd like, and 3 more who found it defensible enough to require careful refutation rather than dismissal. It came down, in the end, to Oren Vasik's 7 minutes. Not to the content of it, though the content was compelling. To the fact of it, to the thing that the council's legal committee had noted. In their formal assessment, in language that was technically precise, and that Yale had read 17 times until she had it memorized. The subject demonstrated autonomous narrative capacity, temporal self-situating, volitional persistence, and identity continuity, under conditions the hegemony's documentation characterized as transformative modification. The subject's continued capacity to express a preference for conditions prior to modification, and to articulate that preference with reference to self-concept, constitutes evidence that the modification was not, by the hegemony's own operational definition, complete. The subject retained the capacity for what the hegemony's research documentation terms resistance to integration. The Council finds that this capacity is not a defect in the modification process, but an intrinsic property of the modified subjects, and therefore that the process does not transform those subjects from persons to resources, but rather constitutes unauthorized modification of persons. Unauthorized modification of persons. Article 17, violated. The first finding in the Council's history against a recognized member species. The hegemony did not withdraw from the war immediately. That was not how these things worked. The ceasefire took another 7 months to negotiate. The terms were complex and contested and left nobody entirely satisfied, which was, the Council's senior mediator noted, generally the signature of a ceasefire that would hold. The hegemony retained their existing territorial claims from the conflict. The 147 colony worlds were a wound that the terms didn't touch, and that wound would be open for a long time. But the program ended. All integration subjects were repatriated, including Atom Units 1 through 6, including Oren Vasek. The repatriation took time. The integration couldn't be fully reversed. The Council's medical teams were very clear about this, careful and honest in the way of people who understood that false hope was a specific kind of a cruelty. The lattice in Oren Vasek's hand was permanent. The modifications to the other 6 were of varying degrees of permanence. What the medical teams could do was address the physiological complications, support reintegration of function, and in several cases restore range of capacity that the hegemony's modifications had impaired. What they couldn't do was unchange something that had already been changed. Oren Vasek knew this. He'd said so, in his 7 minutes, in the language of a structural engineer assessing a modified load-bearing configuration. The structure is changed, but the purpose remains, and purposes can be worked with. She watched him walk through the repatriation gate at Council Station Meridian. 14 months after the night she'd learned his name. He was with the other 6. They walked with the particular awareness of people who were never going to stop assessing exits, who were never going to stop mapping the room, who had been changed in ways they hadn't chosen and were choosing now to determine what those changes meant. She didn't approach him. She wasn't sure she had the right. He found her. She was standing at the observation window of the station's transit hub, watching the ships dock and undock in the patterns of an ordinary operational day, when she heard footsteps behind her that she recognized without seeing. The specific weight distribution she'd filed under a different name, 11 months ago, back when she'd only known his behavioral signature through 2 layers of composite wall. She turned. He was wearing civilian clothes. His left hand was bare. The lattice faintly visible on the skin in the station's bright light, the way a scar is visible in certain angles, present, integrated, neither advertised nor concealed. His eyes were the same eyes Dax had described, tactical, present, running their assessment. He stopped at the right distance, not too close, the distance of a person who respected that some situations required offering space first and letting the other person choose. Oren, he said. Vasek, she said. A pause. The station moved around them. Vithara officials, Kalari diplomats, a Threnic cargo crew, humans from the diplomatic section, the full ordinary polyglot traffic of a place where many kinds of people move through the same space. The engineering firm I worked for, he said. Before, they're rebuilding on the colony. A pause. There's a lot of reconstruction work. He looked at his left hand for a moment, the lattice under the skin, the permanent record of a thing that had been done to him. Then he looked up. The modifications have some advantages for structural assessment. The hegemony didn't design them that way, but it turns out, a small movement at the corner of his mouth. The same movement Dax had described. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one. Turns out you can work with it. She didn't say anything for a moment. She was thinking about Cell 22, about 17 days of deliberate silence as a survival strategy, about the specific intelligence required to distinguish between a fight you could win now and one you had to wait for. The reconstructions in Sector 9, she asked. Most of it, yeah. She looked at the ships in the transit bay. The ordinary traffic of an ordinary day, and under it the weight of 11 years of war, and 147 worlds, and 16 months of proceedings, and 7 minutes in front of the council, and all the things that hadn't been fixed, and all the things that couldn't be unfixed, and all the distance between where they'd been and wherever this was. "I could use a structural engineer," Dax said, from behind her left shoulder. She hadn't heard him approach. She should have. She filed this as evidence that she was more off balance than she'd acknowledged, and turned. He was leaning against the wall of the transit hub, with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had been standing there long enough to have heard most of the conversation and had decided that was acceptable. Cairo was 2 meters to his right, looking at the ship manifest display with the focused attention of a person who was deeply interested in ship manifests, and was absolutely not listening. "I'm not military anymore," Oren said. "I didn't say military," Dax said. "I said engineer." A silence. The station ambient, the ships, the traffic. "There are 18 worlds in the sector that need foundation assessment before any rebuilding can start," Dax said. The hegemony's withdrawal left a lot of structural damage, orbital and surface both. He pushed off the wall. "I have a ship. I have a crew. I have very incomplete survey data and one person who keeps calculating trajectories in his head without instruments." A glance at Cairo, who continued to be deeply interested in the manifest display. "I could use someone who's good at finding where things are trying to fall down." Oren Vasek looked at him. He looked at Yael. He looked at his left hand for a moment, and then he looked out at the transit bay, at the ships, at the stars beyond them that you couldn't see through the station glass, that were there regardless. He thought of something. She could see him think it, whatever it was, the specific compression around his eyes of a person landing on a private conclusion. "All right," he said. It was, she noticed, the same word Dax had used in the processing chamber, in the same tone, with the same precise weight. The word of a person who had decided that the current situation was workable and the outcome worth orienting toward, and who was committing to that orientation without requiring the outcome to be guaranteed first. She recognized it. She thought every human in the building probably recognized it on some level, recognized it the way you recognized the smell of copper and old electricity. Not as something pleasant, but as something known, something that meant you were in a place where things were happening, and you were still alive, and still planning, and still, against all available evidence to the contrary, expecting to come through the other side. She looked at Cairo, who had finished being interested in the manifest display, and was now looking at her with the expression of someone waiting for a final decision. "When do we leave?" she asked. 18 months later, on the third moon of a colony world called Karath 4, Yael Oren stood the edge of a construction site that had been a rubble field when they'd arrived, and was now the foundation of the first new residential block the moon had seen in 7 years. The foundation was, technically, a structural marvel. Oren had designed it around the specific geological instability of the moon's substrate, a problem that had defeated 2 previous engineering teams, and that he'd solved in 4 days by approaching it, he'd said, as a modification rather than a correction. The instability wasn't going away. The block would stand for 200 years. He'd calculated this. She believed it. The sun was setting the particular amber orange of a star, slightly cooler than Sol, and the sky was doing the thing alien skies did, that she'd spent 2 years getting used to and still found startling. The color was wrong. The spectrum shifted, a purple into gold that didn't match the colors her eyes had been calibrated to expect. For the 31 years before she'd left Earth, beautiful in the specific way of things that were genuinely different, rather than variations on familiar, she sat on the foundation edge with a water canteen and watched it. Behind her, from somewhere in the construction camp, Thomas, singing, not quietly anymore. He'd stopped being quiet about it somewhere in the 3rd month of the reconstruction work, when he'd apparently decided that the circumstances no longer required conservation, and the song he was singing was in the same language she'd never identified from the ventilation acoustics of the holding block, something melodic, unhurried, with the rising structure of a song that expected to go on for a while. She didn't know what it meant. She'd asked him once, and he'd said it was an old song. Not his language originally, something his grandmother had taught him, something about persistence. She hadn't asked more than that. She'd learned to not need more than that. Cairo appeared at her elbow with a second water canteen and sat down with the casual confidence of someone who knew the space would be offered. He had a structural diagram tucked under his arm, which meant he and Oren had been working on the next block and had gotten somewhere worth pausing. "The council delegation lands tomorrow," he said. "I know. The Quillari Observer from Station CMO 447 is in the party." A pause. "Station Officer V9. She asked to see the Foundation." Yale thought about Station Officer V9, who had read a transmission twice before acting, and who had used a clause in her operating mandate that her supervisors hadn't anticipated. "Good," she said. "She asked to see it specifically," Cairo said. "Not the colony, not the reconstruction project, the Foundation." Yael looked at the foundation she was sitting on. Oren's work. 200 years of calculated stability against a substrate that didn't want to hold anything up. "She can see it," she said. They sat for a while in the amber light. Thomas's song moved through the construction camp and dispersed into the open air. Somewhere, in the camp's makeshift common area, she could hear Lev's voice, low and deliberate, telling someone something, and Rosario's answering laugh, bright and sudden and real. 22 humans on a moon in Sector 9. More ships arriving. More people coming back to what had been left. Not the same as before. It couldn't be the same as before. The war had been 11 years long, and 147 worlds didn't come back just because a ceasefire was signed, and some legal findings were entered into the Council's record. You didn't reverse what had been done any more than you could pull the lattice out of Oren Vasek's hand and call it healed. But you worked with it. That was the thing. That was the mechanism the hegemony had never successfully modeled, despite 11 years of trying, despite all their technical sophistication and their efficient protocols, and their genuinely excellent xenobiological research, the specific human capacity to work with it, to take a situation that was damaged beyond the original design parameters, and look at it not as a failure state, but as a new set of conditions to solve for. The sky went from amber to deep purple gold, to something that didn't have a name in any language she knew. She breathed it in. Cold air, thin by Earth standards, carrying the smell of construction dust and something underneath it. Green, alive, the particular olfactory signal of a world's biology, reasserting itself at the edges of disturbed ground. Things growing in the margins, stubbornly, without consulting anyone about whether the conditions were suitable. "Dax is back," Cairo said. She looked toward the landing pad. The survey shuttle was down, lights on in the cabin. She could see through the port, the shapes of people moving, Dax's silhouette, recognizable at any distance, and beside it Oren's, the two of them doing the thing they always did when they came back from survey runs. Standing in the shuttle doorway before deplaning, the both of them looking at the construction before they stepped into it, taking a moment with the whole picture before they got back inside it. She watched them stand there. She thought about a cell that smelled like copper and old electricity, and a voice in a ventilation channel that said, "How long?" And the answer she'd given, and every step between that moment and this one. She thought about what it cost and what it made. She thought about the fact that she was sitting on a foundation on a moon in Sector 9 at sunset, breathing cold alien air, with water in her hand and a song in the background, and 2 years of work behind her, and more work ahead. Alive in the particular way that meant alive and planning and present and oriented, not toward a guarantee, because there were no guarantees, but toward an outcome she'd decided was worth the orientation. That was the mechanism. That was the thing the hegemony had tried to subtract from the 7th integration and found they couldn't. That was the thing the peer-reviewed literature had never successfully measured. That was the thing that the Quacalari observer in Station CMO 447 had recognized in 11 minutes and 27 seconds of unencrypted testimony and acted on against procedure. Because something in the testimony required it. It was not a property of cells or genetics, or the radiation tolerance of Earth-native insects. It was not in the lattice, and it was not in the architecture of the DNA. And it was not anything that the hegemony's processing protocols had accounted for. It was in the decision, the ongoing decision, made and remade in every moment, that could have been used to stop making it. The decision that the situation was workable, and the outcome worth orienting toward, and the timeline open while the outcome remained possible. It was, her grandmother might have said, patience, not giving up, not the same thing. Dax and Oren stepped out of the shuttle into the last of the amber light. She watched them walk toward the camp. She watched the construction workers move around them. Humans, and 2 Kalari engineers they'd hired out of the council delegation's logistics staff. 1 Threnic cartographer who'd attached herself to the project 6 months ago, for reasons she'd never fully explained, and who turned out to be extraordinarily good at the work. 26 people on a moon, building something. Against a sky the color of nothing she had words for, under a star that was cooler than home. She finished her water. She stood up. She went back to work. The council proceedings had, at their center, a question that nobody stated directly, but that everyone in the chamber was actually asking. What is the minimum threshold of personhood? It was not a comfortable question. The council's founding documents had avoided it deliberately, the way founding documents tended to avoid questions that could fracture the coalition before it had time to set. The concordance of personhood had been written around the edges of the question, enumerating specific capacities, specific rights, specific protections, without ever defining the core. Article 17 was the most specific. No recognized sapient organism shall be subjected to non-consensual biological modification for purpose of military application. The hegemony speaker had built her entire defense around the phrase, recognized sapient organism, and specifically around the argument that the integration subjects post-modification occupied a different biological category than they had pre-modification, that the concordance's protections attached to the pre-modification person who had ceased to exist, rather than to the post-modification entity, whose status was therefore an open question. It was technically a coherent argument. The council's legal committee had grappled with it for 9 days before Oren Vasek's 7 minutes made it moot. What his testimony established, what every legal analysis confirmed afterward, including 2 submitted by hegemony sympathetic council members who had clearly been hoping to find a different conclusion, was that continuity of identity was not a legal fiction. It was a measurable phenomenon. And Oren Vasek's measured testimony about his own continuous experience, including his experience of the modification process itself, including his ability to report on the states of the other 6 integration subjects, distinct persons with distinct histories and ongoing perspectives, demonstrated with evidence that the hegemony speaker's argument was empirically false, not just legally contestable. The modification had not produced new entities. It had modified existing ones. The persons had persisted, the protections therefore attached. This was not, the legal analysis noted, a particularly novel conclusion. It was simply one that required the specific evidence that Oren Vasek had provided to become undeniable. The hegemony's speaker had requested recess for 24 hours after his testimony. It was granted. The council's protocol required granting it. During that 24 hours, Yale had sat in the observer gallery, while the human diplomatic section debated what they could reasonably expect, and what they should prepare for. The debate was vigorous and not entirely optimistic. There were reasonable arguments for several outcomes that did not include a ruling in humanity's favor, including several that involved the council finding ways to decline jurisdiction or defer the question to future sessions. She'd left the debate midway through and walked to the observation window of the station's outer ring, where you could see the actual stars. No atmospheric scatter here. Just the cold, clear points of light, the arm of the galaxy spread out across the dark. And somewhere in it, human worlds rebuilding, or in rubble, or in some intermediate state that was neither. Cell 12 had found her there. She'd brought coffee, which she'd spent 3 days figuring out how to make from the station's food preparation system, and which was not quite right but was close enough. Kiru thinks it goes our way, Rosario had said. Kiru is an optimist. He's right about most things. Rosario had leaned against the window frame, holding her coffee with both hands, the healed fractures in her right hand, still occasionally giving her trouble in the cold of the station's environment controls. He calculated the probability at 78%. Based on what? Based on Station Officer V9 choosing to escalate using Clause 44 instead of standard procedure. He says anyone who reads their operating mandate carefully enough to know Clause 44 exists and uses it in a situation like this is someone who's already decided. He says the council follows the lead of the people who've thought hardest about the question. Yale had looked at the stars. She'd thought about that. He might be right, she'd said. He had been right. But the aftermath had not been simple, and she'd known it wouldn't be. Legal findings didn't rebuild worlds. Legal findings didn't reverse biological modifications, or return 11 years in effort, or fill the absence of people who hadn't made it. Legal findings were a framework, and frameworks were what you worked within, and working within a framework was different from the framework solving your problem. She knew this. She'd known it before the ruling. She'd known it in the processing chamber of the hegemony facility, standing at the ventilation grate in the dark, and listening to 31 other people not quite making sounds in their cells. You planned for the outcome you wanted, and you executed toward it, and when you got it, you didn't mistake the getting for the work being done. The ceasefire negotiations hadn't been 7 months of precisely this kind of management of expectations. The USEF's diplomatic team had included 2 people who'd been colony world survivors and 1 person who'd lost family in the fall of the outer defense ring, and they'd sat across from hegemony negotiators for 214 days and built something that held. Not because it was just. It wasn't fully just, and everyone knew it, but because it was functional, and functional was the prerequisite for everything else. Dax had observed part of those negotiations. He'd been brought in twice as a technical consultant on the repatriation terms, and both times she'd watched him sit in the observer section, with the same quality of attention he'd had in the processing chamber, the system that has decided resting, the Beta's current option stillness, and she'd known he was doing the same thing she was, cataloging exits, not physical ones now, possibility exits. The routes through this specific terrain toward an outcome that was worth the orientation. The routes were there. That was the thing. Even in a situation as damaged as this one, with everything that couldn't be undone, sitting on top of everything that might be possible, the routes were there if you looked with the right instrument. The right instrument was, she had concluded after 2 years of evidence gathering, stubbornness applied to careful attention, not to a specific outcome being guaranteed, not to the timeline, just to the attention itself, to continuing to look, to continuing to assess, to maintaining the capacity to recognize a viable route when one appeared. Even when the prior terrain had been nothing but obstacles, the hegemony had analyzed humans extensively. Their xenobiology division was exceptional. Their genetic research had identified real properties, real mechanisms, real things about Earth's evolutionary history that were genuinely remarkable. They'd been right, that Earth's organisms had something worth studying in the resilience department. They'd just been looking at cells when the actual mechanism was much larger and had to be observed at the scale of decisions over time. Station Officer V9, her name, rendered into human approximation, was something like Verath, though she'd told Rosario that the approximation flattened 3 distinct tonal elements into one. and that the meaning was more like the quality of attention that notices what others have agreed to overlook. Arrived on Carith 4's third moon on a clear morning, with a delegation of 4, and a set of survey instruments that she'd specifically requested permission to use on the Foundation. Yale met her at the landing pad. The Kalari were remarkable to look at, in the specific way that Yale had stopped trying to reconcile with human aesthetic frameworks, and had learned to simply observe. They were taller than humans, and moved with a sinuous economy that suggested their bone structure was organized on different principles than a human skeleton, more flexible through the torso, the joints moving with a range that read as unsettling until you acclimated to it. Their skin was a warm bronze silver, iridescent in direct light. Their eyes were large and uniformly dark, no visible iris distinction, with a depth to them that Yale found genuinely difficult to read until she'd spent enough time around them to learn the muscle tells. Vareth's face, as she stepped off the lander and looked at the construction site, did the thing that Yale had learned to read as the Quillari version of being impressed while trying not to show it: a slight flattening of the brow structure, a fractional widening of the eyes, the specific stillness of a person recalibrating. "This wasn't here 18 months ago," Vareth said. "Rubble field," Yale confirmed. "How many structures in total?" 11 completed, 7 in progress. "We're working outward from the original settlement center. The geology gets more complex as you go. The substrate is unstable past the 3rd-kilometer radius. Oren's working on a modified foundation approach for the outer sections." Vareth looked at her. "Oren Vasek." "Yes." A pause that was, in Quillari conversational patterns, thoughtful rather than hesitant. "I read his testimony again before the trip," Vareth said. "I've read it many times." "I know. He knows too. Does he mind?" Yale considered. "He minds that it was necessary," she said. "Not that you read it." Vareth processed this with that characteristic depth of eye that Yale still found difficult to read. Then she picked up her survey instruments and nodded toward the Foundation. "May I?" "That's what you came for." They walked the Foundation together. Vareth moved slowly, methodically, her instruments making the particular clicking sequences that indicated active scanning at multiple frequencies. She paused at several points: the corner joints, the load distribution nodes that Oren had designed around the substrate's specific instability, the sections where the modified approach was most visible in the material pattern. At the 4th corner node, she stopped for a long time. "This is not a standard solution," she said. "No. I don't recognize the engineering framework. He invented it. For this specific problem, the standard frameworks assumed a stable substrate. He designed around the instability instead of against it." Yale paused. "He said it was a modification rather than a correction. You can't fix what the substrate is, but you can build something that accounts for what it actually is, instead of what you'd prefer it to be." Vareth looked at the corner node for another long moment. Then she looked at the sky, the amber-lit morning sky of a world that had been occupied and damaged, and was now, from this single moon, very slowly doing something else. "The Council passed the expanded reconstruction assistance package last month," she said. "I don't know if you received the communication. We did. More is coming." It was not. A pause. The brow flattening again, this time reading as something more effortful. "It was not an easy vote. The hegemony still has significant influence over several delegations. There were arguments about interference in regional affairs, arguments about precedent, arguments that the finding in the Phelps proceeding was narrower than its subsequent application suggests. And Station Officer V9 submitted a formal observation to the full council prior to the vote," Vareth said, with a precision that suggested she'd thought carefully about how to say this, noting that the quality of attention paid to a matter tends to determine whether subsequent actions are adequate to it. Yale looked at her. "That observation was logged in the official record," Vareth continued, "and was cited by 11 delegates in their explanation of vote. It passed by 31 to 12. 23 more worlds. 23 more sets of rubble fields that could become in time, something like what she was standing in. It didn't give back what had been taken. It didn't fill the 11 years, or the 147 colony worlds, or any of the specific absences that were as permanent in their way as the lattice under Orin Vasic's skin. But it was material, and material mattered, and the distance between having the material and not having it was measured in people who could rebuild and people who couldn't. "Thank you," she said. Vareth tilted her head in the acknowledging gesture that Yale had learned was Kalari for. "The thanks are misallocated, but I accept the sentiment. Your broadcast was what made it possible," she said, "and the engineer who designed this foundation." A pause. "And the person who decided to use Clause 44, because the alternative was waiting for a committee, and the 31 people who made small human sounds in their cells for 6 weeks," Yale said. Vareth considered this. "Yes," she said. "Them too." They walked the rest of the foundation in a comfortable silence. The morning moved around them. Thomas's song had started up from the direction of the common area, visible now in the angle of the sun, his silhouette on a crate outside the mess structure, head tilted back, the song going up into the amber sky of an alien morning, with the specific, unhurried confidence of a song that had been sung many times before and expected to be sung many times more. Vareth stopped walking. She listened for a moment with that full attention stillness. "What is that?" she asked. "I don't know," Yale said. "He learned it from his grandmother." "It's a very old pattern," Vareth said. "The interval structure, it's one of the oldest musical forms recognized across multiple species. Not the melody. The intervals, the specific mathematical relationship between them." She paused. "We have something similar. Not the same, but the interval relationship is universal, or close enough. It appears independently in the musical traditions of 11 council species." Yale listened to Thomas's song, move through the construction site and up. "What does it mean?" she asked. "The interval structure." Vareth's dark eyes did the depth thing that Yale had learned to read, as the Quillari equivalent of searching for words in a language that didn't have quite the right ones. "Continuation," Vareth said finally. "It's the interval structure of continuation, the musical statement that the song is not finished." A pause. "That there is more to come." The sun moved overhead. The amber light went to gold and back to amber. The foundation sat solid under their feet, designed for a substrate that wanted to move, built to account for what the ground actually was. From the common area, Thomas's voice kept rising. Somewhere on the site, the sound of tools beginning again, Cairo's measured cadence, Lev's heavier rhythm, the particular sequence of sounds that meant work resuming after a pause, the ordinary percussion of people building things on a moon in Sector 9, alive and present and oriented towards something. The timeline open, the outcome worth it. Yale Orin stood in the amber morning of an alien world and listened. She thought, yes, more to come,